Chapter 26 of Neighbours by Florence Morse Kingsley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mrs. Pettibone had just taken up her child from his afternoon nap, in the moist, pink, entirely adorable condition peculiar to a baby going on 7 months. After she had kissed, cuddled, and cooed over him in a hopelessly old-fashioned manner, she knocked on the study door. Mrs. Pettibone had never given up this modest custom when thus intruding upon her husband's solitude. He did not at once answer, and boldly, very boldly, his son upon her arm, she repeated her summons. " Why don't you walk right in, Miss Philura? " demanded Mr. Pettibone's laughing voice from within. Mrs. Pettibone blushed. She always blushed when he called her Miss Philura, thus reminding her of all the sweet and wonderful happenings of a not distant past. " I wanted you to see him, Silas," she said. " He's wonderful to day. And you know, Silas, he'll never be just 6 months and 4 days old again." " True," admitted Mr. Pettibone. " I hadn't thought of it in that way before." " I think of it every day," she sighed. He's growing up so fast, Silas." " But we want him to grow up, don't we? We wouldn't like to see him atrophied in babyhood, would we? "" Of course not. But he's so sweet, just as he is. Look at his eyes, Silas. He's looking at you, see? He wants you to take him and play with him." Mr. Pettibone promptly abandoned Volume 4 of a series of commentaries on the Pauline epistles in favour of the baby, who began to gurgle and kick with delight as his father held out his arms for him. " Just 6 months and 4 days old this morning," repeated Mrs. Pettibone, gazing at her treasures in the shabby armchair with unconcealed delight. " I can hardly believe it, Silas. If anyone had told me 5 years ago — was that the door bell? It doesn't ring very well lately." He heard her voice in greeting, which seemed to convey a note of surprise. Then the parlour door closed. Mr. Pettibone gazed in some perplexity at his son. Surely it was a man's voice he had heard in the passage. 5 minutes elapsed, and still she didn't return. The baby, tiring of the minister's silver watch and of his persistently offered key ring, which the infant finally cast upon the floor with a shrill little yelp of displeasure, was becoming somewhat uninteresting as compared with Volume 4 of the Pauline commentaries. Mr. Pettibone paced the length of his study several times, inanely repeating " Pretty? Pretty? " in the presence of his rows of theological books. The infant quite evidently failed to appreciate this form of entertainment, for he began to howl lustily. The infant's clothing, moreover, displayed a strange tendency to creep up about his ears. In vain the distracted Mr. Pettibone strove to pat and pull these inchoate garments into place, as he had seen his wife do a score of times. Finally, in despair, he deposited the small demoralized bundle of muslin and flannel on the floor, and stood looking down at it dubiously. The minister could think of no adequate reason for the infant's displeasure, but there appeared to be little doubt of it in view of his screams. Mrs. Pettibone opened the door upon his discomfiture. " Why, Silas Pettibone! " she exclaimed. " What are you doing to the baby? Come here to mother, darling." There was implied censure in her voice and the way in which she skilfully righted the infant's garments and hushed his abominable crying, which was not meekly to be borne. " I was not doing anything to the baby, my dear Philura," protested Mr. Pettibone with unwonted spirit. " I merely held on to him as long as I was able, and then "" Never mind, Silas," said his wife, with the new and superior forbearance he had noted in her manner of late. " Please come and speak to M. Desaye. I've been talking with him. He wanted to see me. But I thought perhaps we ought to consult you. Besides, I heard the baby." Mr. Pettibone gazed at his wife with honest amazement. She had thought perhaps — well, well! M. Desaye, in an immaculate frock coat and striped trousers, a black pearl in his scarf and a flower in his buttonhole, presented a pleasant contrast to the somewhat dishevelled minister. " The baby," said Mrs. Pettibone, " wanted me. Now, I think we can go on with our little talk. Possibly Mr. Pettibone can advise you better than I about your daughter, though I'm sure everything will be all right." " My Madeleine has no mother," said M. Desaye gravely. " Had it been God's will that Madame, my wife, survive to now, it would not have been necessaire to consult a stranger. I regret the grand trouble I make with you, but it is impossible to avoid. You understand me, is it not? "" Harry Schwartz has been making love to Madeleine," explained Mrs. Pettibone, very pink and smiling. " I've been telling M. Desaye that Harry is a splendid boy. We've always known him. He thought Harry was a German spy." " German spy? " repeated Mr. Pettibone. " No, no, indeed. Let me assure you, sir, Harry Schwartz is one of our own Sunday school boys. He is above suspicion of anything like that." " But he is of German blood," persisted the Frenchman, polite but unyielding. " You will of your kindness pardon me if I say that is for me suffisamment. Beyond, he has also deceive me. I think him Huguenot, the name of Le Noir. I find him German, name of Schwartz. What will you? " M. Desaye's eyes, shoulders, and outspread hands were eloquent of disbelief, but his expression suddenly changed to one of amazement and alarm. " Ecoutez! " he exclaimed sharply. " What is that? " All three occupants of the parsonage parlour sprang to their feet. That loud, booming explosion which had shaken the old house from rafter to cellar, what was it? Mr. Pettibone was the first to recover himself. " I'm told they're at work constructing a new state road some miles away," he began. " It was probably necessary blasting. I believe " But again the terrible sound interrupted the minister's explanation. Then followed many short and sharp explosions, like the discharge of volleys of musketry. " Oh, it must be something awful! " murmured Mrs. Pettibone, clasping her baby closer. M. Desaye stood with bent head, the frown with which he had listened to the minister's somewhat vague defence of Harry Schwartz deepening between his eyes. The sound of the explosions continued. Now heavy, dull, shattering noises; again that sudden bursting crackle, like machine guns in action. Then he spoke one French word, which the world pronounces as it will. " Munitions! " The two men, moved by a single impulse, rushed out of doors. But Mrs. Pettibone, her baby in her arms, hurriedly climbed the stair to the nursery. The terrible sounds continued, but in this quiet, sunny room, with its small pendant garments and its white furniture, one somehow felt safe from immediate catastrophe. She had not comprehended M. Desaye's laconic explanation, and in her confusion she began mechanically to gather the baby's garments into a neat bundle. Perhaps they would be obliged to fly. Other women the world over had been forced into the open, their babies in their arms. Something terrible and unexpected was happening. She must be ready. Yes, and extra socks and handkerchiefs for Mr. Pettibone. Would he need his pajamas? She strove to think calmly. Where was the baby's talcum powder? A sound of trampling feet on the stair mingled with a fusillade of frightful explosions. " Well, for th' land sake, Mis' Pettibone !" exclaimed the strident voice of Mrs. Wessells from the door. " Ain't this th' livin' limit? I was a washin' home t' day, this bein' a Thursday, an' I had m' han's in th' suds when in runs Georgie. ' Ma,' he says, ' th' works is blowin' up,' he says. ' What works? ' I says. ' For goodness sake, Georgie !'' Why, them bomb works out b' th' swamp, Ma,' he says. He's on to everything, my George, he is. I tell you, Mr. Pettibone, there can't nothing take place without him knowing it first off. He's the smartest boy, our Georgie. Why, what in creation are you doing? Packing up? Oh, 'tain't going to do no great harm in the village, Miss Pettibone. But I bet the swamp will be chock full of remains after the bombs is all fired off. Here they come now, a-running like a pack of lunatics. Oh, look, Mrs. Pettibone, for pity's sake, just see 'em. The minister's wife needed no second bidding. The sound of hundreds of running feet drew her to the window. Workmen from the plant, fleeing from the terrific bombardment meant for others, were hurrying past the house in small irregular squads, a confused rabble of women and crying children bringing up the rear. They had passed the danger zone, but they were still running, their eyes fixed and staring, their feet striking the pavement with dull, heavy thuds. " Well, I guess I'd better be going along," said Mrs. Wessells, gathering her shawl under her chin with an air of keen enjoyment. " Thinks I'll stop in first off and see if anything hit the parsonage yet. Oh, land, if there ain't Harry Schwartz a-scorching along on his bike. I didn't know as he worked out there, did you? But I guess he must of. His clothes is all black." Mrs. Pettibone turned from the window, her face pale and anxious. She was recalling confusedly certain scraps of her conversation with M. Desaye. He had insisted that Harry Schwartz was working at the munitions plant under an assumed name. But it must be time for the baby's bottle. Little whimpering sounds from the crib reminded her of the paramount fact. She followed Mrs. Wessells downstairs. In the hall Mr. Pettibone was talking with 2 or 3 excited neighbours. The house seemed suddenly full of people. The baby was crying upstairs. Mrs. Pettibone found herself trying to comfort a distracted woman who declared her son had been killed. And still the terrible sound of exploding shells rent the air. No one in Innisfield learned the full extent of the disaster that day, nor the next. The detonations continued fitfully during the afternoon and well on into the night, when a dull red glow streaked with brilliant arcs of light revealed the spot where the munitions works had stood. Mounted police from Boston and fire engines from nearby towns invaded the streets, and by daybreak a tentative effort was made to round up the workmen. It was thought at first that many were missing, but as the hours passed it appeared that several who had run blindly from the scene of the disaster had become entangled in the more distant fastnesses of the swamp, from which they emerged covered with slime, their clothing torn to shreds, but otherwise uninjured. On Sunday morning Mr. Pettibone, pale but calm in the face of a large and excited congregation, rendered heartfelt thanks to God for the almost miraculous preservation of human life during the late terrifying calamity. That not one of the hundreds of workmen employed had met with sudden death was due to the extraordinary presence of mind and bravery of one young man. So Mr. Pettibone informed the Almighty, and incidentally his congregation. After a time-honored custom, the long prayer was devoted to a masterly recapitulation of recent events, previously unknown to mortals, but without reasonable doubt stored up in the divine intelligence from the foundation of the world. At its close Mrs. Buckthorn was seen to nudge her neighbour, Miss Electa Pratt. " Who'd he mean? " she whispered. " What young man? "" I guess it must 'a' been that young Hobbs," Miss Electa whispered back from behind her hymn book. " They say he telephoned all over the plant after Sadie Banks fainted dead away settin' in her chair. After he'd got everybody on the run, he drug her out an' revived her, an' she come home 's lively as a cricket. But he didn't come home for most 2 hours. Most everybody thought he was killed. His mother took on till you could hear her down in the store." As these circumstantial details were already known to Mrs. Buckthorn, she listened without comment, her large countenance composed to a pious rigidity befitting the time and occasion. It was not until the benediction had been pronounced and the organ burst forth in vague triumph that she turned again to Miss Pratt. " I suppose," she said in a hollow voice, that you've heard the terrible intelligence about Harry Schwartz." "My gracious me!" cried Miss Pratt, pausing round-eyed in the act of buttoning her jacket. "Was he killed?" Mrs. Buckthorn shook her head. " I almost wish I could say the Lord's will be done to that question, Electa," she syllabled slowly. " No, he ain't dead. He's been arrested, and he's in jail." " Harry Schwartz arrested? In jail? " shrilled Miss Pratt. " Why, I run into Mrs. Schwartz only last night after supper to borrow a cup of sugar, and she didn't say anything about Harry's being arrested." Mrs. Buckthorn continued solemnly to oscillate her massive headgear. Out of the corner of her eye she beheld Mrs. Obed Salter, Mrs. Undertaker Beels, and Mrs. Henry Pratt advancing down the aisle. They had not heard the news. " No, Electa," she said distinctly. " Mrs. Schwartz was not aware of her son's disgrace at that hour. I understand Harry was preparing to retire for the night when "" I s'pose they had to put regular handcuffs onto him," offered Miss Pratt. She also had noted the approaching bevy of ladies, and framed her comment thus dramatically with purpose. " Oh, for pity's sake, what's happened now? " demanded Mrs. Salter excitedly. " Who's been handcuffed? I ain't heard a word." " Nor me, neither," chimed in Mrs. Pratt. Mrs. Undertaker Beels, as became her husband's gloomy trade, preserved a non committal silence. But her eyes under their black lashes were active and observant. Mrs. Buckthorn sighed heavily. " I suppose," she said, with an air of reluctance, " that we can hardly hope to keep the matter to ourselves, much as we should be glad to spare the young man's family. They do say his picture, took in jail, will be in all the papers to morrow. My ! When I think how during our late blessed revival I set an' watched that young man, an' him a lookin' serious for the first time in his life, an' of how I went personally an' labored with him face to face, doing my prayerful best to draw him out of the mourner's pew, an' how " But the flood of question and comment which had been gathering in force could no longer be stayed. Even the taciturn Mrs. Beels insisted upon being heard. " George Beels knew of Harry Schwartz's arrest early this morning," she stated. " Mr. Schwartz was around trying to get bail." " What did he do? " demanded the other women in chorus, turning with one accord to Mrs. Beels. " Why did they arrest him? "" Ladies," spoke Mrs. Buckthorn loudly and authoritatively, " if you'll listen to me " But Mrs. Beels triumphantly held the floor. She could be depended upon to be brief and to the point, without reservation or rhetorical embellishment. " They say he blew up the plant," she said bluntly. " But I know he didn't. So there." " Ladies," intoned Mrs. Buckthorn, " I can tell you something awful if you'll pay attention to me. That poor misguided young man, who will undoubtedly be hung in the near future, was arrested because " Mr. Pettibone's tall black coated figure suddenly appeared in the center of the excited group. Not one of the women had noticed his approach, but its effect was magical. Even Mrs. Buckthorn became silent for a moment. In that moment the minister spoke. " I wish you would all disperse quietly to your homes," he said in low, even tones. " I see you've heard of the terrible accusation which has been lodged against a young man who has grown up in our midst, one of our own children. I believe him to be innocent of the horrible crime laid at his door, and until he has been proven guilty he is entitled to that belief by the rulings of common law." Mrs. Buckthorn wagged her bonnet, decorated with a plenitude of black beads as hard and soulless as her eyes. " As to that, I guess each and every one of us is entitled to our private opinion, Mr. Pettibone," she said acidly. " And when it comes to "" Let me implore you to keep that opinion as private as possible, Mrs. Buckthorn," interrupted the minister. His gaze, anxious and troubled, passed quickly from one plump matronly face to another, then his head drooped. " The tide of public opinion seems to be setting strongly against the lad," he said slowly. " Let us hope that the members of this church will entertain the reasonable doubt, and give voice to none but charitable comments. Go home, I beg of you, and pray that the truth may become speedily apparent." The rustle of Sabbath skirts and the sound of hushed footfalls ceased at length, and silence, broken only by the sighing of the wind, brooded the sanctuary. Still the tall, spare figure of the minister stood motionless, his hands folded loosely upon the pew front. " O Lord, Thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever Thou hadst formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, Thou art God." The majestic words rose to his lips unbidden. In them was the strong comfort his soul craved. " Even from everlasting to everlasting, Thou art God." As he passed at length down the aisle, he almost stumbled upon a small figure kneeling there in the gloom of the projecting gallery. The next instant he had recognized the young French girl, Madeleine Desaye, her face stained with weeping. " Me I have come," she whispered, " to pray le bon Dieu for Harry." Chapter 27 of Neighbours by Florence Morse Kingsley. Harry Schwartz sat on a wooden bench in the Innisfield jail. It was Sunday; he heard the church bells ringing. After a while he got up and looked out of the barred window high up in the wall. People were walking along the streets, and at first he did not associate himself with the fact that nearly every one looked up at the jail as they walked along. Then a slow, painful crimson surged up into his brain, forcing the tears to his eyes. He went back to his bench and sat down. It seemed a long time since yesterday morning. He forced himself to go back to the moment when he had stood by the kitchen table, watching his mother cutting sandwiches for his lunch. " Harry," she said, " I wish you'd give up working way out there at the munitions plant. I worry about you dreadfully." " Why should you worry, mother? " It was a comment rather than a question. He knew well enough why his mother worried. It had all been talked over a score of times in the last month, but while she spread the thick slices of home-made bread, with plenty of butter, and added a generous filling of minced chicken, she told him all her reasons once more. Harry swallowed childishly as he remembered how good those sandwiches had tasted at noon. The conversation ended as usual. Harry fastened his lunch box to the handle of his bicycle, kissed his mother good bye, and sped away. He intended to stop working in the munitions plant as soon as his building lot was paid for. After that he could borrow the money to build his home, but in the meantime his weekly pay envelopes, bearing the name Le Noir, worried him. At least once every week, generally on pay day, Harry found himself going over the whole matter with himself. Le Noir was merely a French translation of Schwartz. He meant no harm by accepting Madeleine's smooth substitute for his harsh German name. He did his work honestly and well. What possible harm could there be in a small deception? There wasn't any harm in it. But Harry guessed he'd better stop working at the plant before long. He hated to have his mother worry. Of course, he'd never showed her his pay envelope with the name Le Noir on it. He knew about what she would say, and very likely she would cry, which was worse. He had not seen Madeleine since the night he told her he loved her, though he had studied his French every night and had learned the inadequate word for wife. He got up from his bench again and went to the window. His head ached when he thought of Madeleine. Looking down into the familiar street, which somehow looked unfamiliar seen from this barred window, his thoughts went monotonously on. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened till afternoon. Everybody was working as usual. He saw Hobbs counting shells about 1:30, and at 2:00 he met him crossing the yard. Harry had not spoken to Hobbs since the night of the revival. Why should he speak to Hobbs? The fellow owed him an apology. It might have been half an hour later when he heard a slight explosion and saw a sudden flare-up of brilliant light in the filling shed. He was on his way to investigate the reason for this when somebody shouted to him to run. Suddenly the yard was full of men, running, cursing, shouting. Harry looked around for Hobbs. To his surprise, he found himself thinking of Hobbs with keen anxiety. Then came the first heavy explosion. Harry jumped upon his wheel, which he had left by the gate, and rode swiftly toward home. Something hit him in the back of the head as he went, but he didn't notice it. He was thinking of his mother, who would be worrying dreadfully. He must let her know he was all right. The church bells had stopped ringing by now. Harry wondered dully if his father and mother had gone to church. He pictured them there in the fourth pew from the pulpit, where he seemed to see himself, a very little boy with yellow curls on his shoulder, looking at Deacon Scrimger's shining bald head 2 seats in front. Sometimes, when the sermon was long, his mother would give him a pink and white peppermint drop out of her pocket. He would grow very sleepy after the peppermint was eaten. How comfortable his mother's smooth silken lap felt as he laid his head upon it. And after that, the preacher's voice seemed to come peacefully from a great way off, and then it ceased altogether. A queer, hard lump in Harry's throat ached intolerably as he thought about it. His mother had cried when they took him away last night. They'd come for him just as he was going to bed after the nice warm bath she had insisted upon. The covers of his bed were turned down, and the breeze from the open windows fluttered the muslin curtains. "I'm glad it isn't any worse," he told her, when she exclaimed over the matted hair at the back of his head. He'd forgotten all about the something that hit him on his way out of the plant. His mother called his father to look at the tiny scalp wound. She wondered if there ought to be a stitch taken. Should they call the doctor? It was just then that the door-bell rang sharply. The sound of a key grating in the lock roused him. He turned his head and saw his father coming into his cell, followed by another man. "Well, Harry, my boy," said his father, with an affectation of great cheerfulness, "how did you make out last night?" Harry made no answer. He was looking at the other man. He'd known him by sight for a long time. The man's name was Calvin S. Northrup, and he was a lawyer. Mr. Northrup returned Harry's look sharply. Then he rubbed his hands, which were dry and bony. "Bad business, very bad business," he said, and glanced around the cell. Water coming in through the ceiling. Roof wants repairing. Well, now, let's look into this business." He sat down on the wooden chair and again stared at Harry. "I've engaged Mr. Northrup to defend you, Harry," explained Mr. Schwartz. Just so," confirmed the lawyer. "Now then, don't incriminate yourself, young man." And he wagged a long, yellow finger at Harry. "Don't forget what I tell you. The prosecution will likely put you through the 3rd degree. I'm told they're preparing their case for the preliminary hearing, which may take place tomorrow. But until you're proved guilty—" "I'm not guilty," said Harry, with some violence. "I didn't blow up the plant. Why should I?" "That's just the line of defense Calvin S. Northrup intends to follow," approved the lawyer. "Why should you blow up the plant? Exactly. Now, you'll have to be careful what you say. They'll try to catch you with all sorts of tricky questions. They'll endeavor to mix you up, bewilder you, but you just stick to that one statement. You don't know anything about the cause of the explosion. You went to your work as usual, always faithful. Didn't hear or see anything out of the common until—" "But I did," interrupted Harry. "I saw—" Mr. Northrup's active eyebrows and waving forefinger halted Harry's eager explanation. "Why shouldn't I tell?" asked Harry, bewildered. "I saw—" "Young man, you didn't see anything, and you didn't hear anything until after, mark my word carefully, until after you left the plant. You got out at the first alarm. Now then, paste that in your hat." Mr. Northrup wrinkled his lean face into the semblance of a smile. "Fact is," he said, sinking his voice to a whisper, "you've got yourself into a devilish fix, young fellow. I'd a little rather your father had gone elsewhere for counsel, but seeing your family has been resident in our town for a considerable while, and you yourself bear a good general reputation, Calvin S. Northrup has undertaken the case. But you'll have to follow his advice to the letter, or he'll drop it." Harry's father wiped the perspiration from his forehead. "Guess you'd better do as he says, Harry," he said huskily. "Mr. Calvin S. Northrup ought to know what's—" "Calvin S. Northrup does know," exploded the lawyer, expanding his narrow chest. "My experience as a criminal lawyer stands behind every word I have said. Let me tell you, last year I was sent for from Boston to defend a young man accused of murder in the first degree. I advised him as I have advised you. Did he profit by it? No." "Did you get him off, sir?" inquired Mr. Schwartz, after a heavy pause. Mr. Northrup eyed his client with a frown. "The accused was as guilty as hell," he stated. "I saw it the minute I laid eyes on him. It stuck out all over him, and he would talk about himself. Couldn't stop him. Executed last week. Not my fault." Mr. Northrup glanced sideways at Harry, as if to note the effect of his words. "Now maybe you'll watch your step," he added jocularly. "Of course, that alias of yours is a bad bit of evidence, and I'm afraid we can't disprove it. Name on company's blanks in your own handwriting, employment clerk ready to swear it was signed in his presence. Clerk might be proved insane, though I shall, if forced to it, prove you insane. Insanity in the family, and that sort of thing. And mind you don't deny it, either of you." Harry's face reddened. "See here," he said thickly, "you've got another guess coming about me. I didn't blow up the plant, but I did sign under the name of Lenoir. I did it because they weren't taking on Germans. I'm an American, but I've got a German name. You may as well give up my case right now. I shan't try to lie out of anything I've done." "Harry," said Mr. Schwartz in a broken voice, "you ought to be thinking of your poor mother. She's sick, Harry. I didn't tell you before, but—" The young man turned violently upon his father. "You think I did it?" he cried in a shocked voice. "Come, my lad, don't get excited," exhorted Mr. Northrup. "We'll do the best we can for you, depend upon it. But we're going to leave you to think it over. Yes, to reconsider. You're no fool, I can see that. Now, Mr. Schwartz, we've plenty to do. Nothing to be gained by further talk with the accused." Harry did not look at his father as the two men turned to go out. The key grated in the lock. It seemed to be grating in his soul. He realized now that half unconsciously he had been waiting for his father's strong interference. Of course everybody would know he was innocent of the monstrous charge against him. He'd go home to his Sunday dinner, somewhat soiled with the disgrace of his night in jail, somewhat sheepish under the curious eyes of the neighbours, but ready to laugh ruefully over the unhappy blunder of the local police. The lump in his throat hurt him cruelly as he thought of his mother. He wondered dully if she had found his pay envelope marked with the name Lenoir. Why hadn't he told her all about it? The town clock struck 12 after a dreary hour spent in pacing up and down the narrow limits of his cell. The jailer brought him his dinner on a battered tin plate. Somebody, it might have been another prisoner, tossed in a newspaper. It contained an account of the explosion. Harry saw a villainous picture of himself under the big headlines, "German plot unearthed. Chief conspirator working in Merck's plant under assumed name. Other arrests may follow." He forced himself to read the page, while the Sunday dinner on the battered tin plate developed rims of solidified grease about its slabs of meat and dingy mounds of vegetables. Harry drank a cup of muddy coffee and read on. He saw himself described as a big, hulking fellow with a sinister eye. He'd been for some time in the pay of the German government. His expenditures proved it. Short work would doubtless be made of the Schwartz case, there being not a shadow of doubt of guilt of the accused. The keeper looked at Harry with a sort of respect when he came to take away the untasted dinner. "Some job for a young fellow like you," he observed. "But of course you didn't do it by your lonesome. I'd peach on my pals higher up if I was you." "I didn't do it," said Harry wearily. "No? Nice picture they got of you in the paper. Say, I guess you'll find your appetite by tomorrow. Better eat while you can get real victuals. They won't treat you so well upstate." When Harry failed to respond to this playful allusion to his undoubted fate, the friendly official chuckled. "Take it from me, you innocent guys wins the bun. Say, you got a real baby stare, ain't you? But don't you try no hunger strike on yours truly. I got your number all right, young fella." It was 3:00 in the afternoon when Miss Malvina Bennett called. Harry had abandoned his introspective studies and was gazing out of the window at the procession of Sunday pedestrians. He'd ceased to notice their upward glances at his window. It seemed a long time since he'd talked with his father and Mr. Northrup. Of course, everybody had read the papers. He turned a lacklustre eye upon Miss Bennett as she hesitated before his door. "Sweetheart to see you," announced his jailer facetiously. "I ain't going to look." "You go 'long, Ed Lucas," Miss Bennett exhorted him. "I ain't seen an awful sight of you since you used to steal apples off my sweetin' tree. I guess you was about the meanest boy in town in them days, and you ain't changed much except for your whiskers." Upon the retreat of the discomfited official, Miss Malvina went up to Harry and laid her hands upon his shoulders. "I ain't a-goin' to pity you none," she said briskly. "If there's anything I hate on top of the ground, it's the p'ison sentiment folks calls sympathy. But I will say this. I believe in you right down to the ground, Harry. You may have made a mistake. Most folks do, one time or another. But I know you're all right. Ma Bennett thinks the same as me, and so does Madeleine Desaye and her pa." Harry's unhappy face brightened. "Oh, does she?" he asked eagerly. "Oh, meanin' Ma Bennett, of course," chuckled Miss Malvina. "Now, you just set down, and you and me'll take counsel together, as it says in the Psalms. But first off, ain't you hungry? I'll bet Miss Lucas can't cook a decent meal of victuals to save her life. When the two of them got appointed to this here jail, I says to Ma, malefactors, I says, '11 get all that's comin' to 'em just from eatin' 'Liza Jane Lucas's cookin'. Anyhow, I brought you some ham sandwiches and a lemon pie, and some of Madeleine's gaiters. She brought 'em over to me this mornin' a purpose. But when I come in and asked for you, I had to laugh. 'What you got in your basket, Miss Malvina?' says Ed Lucas, kind of important. 'We have to be careful,' he says, 'what goes into desperate criminals.' Well, Ed, I says to him, 'I guess you done well to take up your residence in jail on your own hook. It's where you belong,' I says. 'As for desperate criminals,' I says, 'I ain't got no dealin's with 'em. I've come to see Harry Schwartz, and I brought him something fit to eat, knowing full well he wouldn't get no relishin' victuals here.' With that, I opens up my basket and showed him this here pie. Oh, land! You could fairly see Ed's mouth a-watering. That's right. Just you pitch into them sandwiches. You don't want to get all run down and tuckered out. I tell you got to keep a stiff upper lip. It's going to come out all right." Miss Malvina beamed upon Harry like sun upon the frozen ground. In the generous warmth of her friendly presence he swallowed the aching lump in his throat and ate the sandwiches to the last crumb, and likewise the pie with its delicately fragrant lemon filling. " That tastes like mother's pie," he said wistfully. " 'Tis," confirmed Miss Malvina. " I went in to see your Ma. I heard she was just prostrate, and 'twas an awful shock havin' her boy took off the way they done. The' wa'n't a mite of excuse fer it, neither. 'Twas them measly Boston d'tectives an' the local p'lice. They feel kind o' cheap ef they can't arrest somebody. Most anybody '11 do, so's they git their names in print. Reminds me of an old dog we used to have at home. He'd chase a squirrel till he was all beat out, then he'd fetch a stick to Pa an' lay it down afront of him, tail a waggin' s' much as to say, ' Oh, ain't I some dog !'' Your Ma's feelin' better, but I says to her, for pity's sake don't go over there an' cry over Harry. It'll take the tuck all out of him,' I says. So she's a goin' to brace up, same as I told her, an' I guess you'll see her by t' morrow. Eat a gaiter, do. Mad'lane '11 be awful pleased when I tell her." " They're too pretty to eat," protested Harry, sighing over the delicate scalloped cakes. " I s'pose she must be "" She says it's all her fault," interrupted Miss Bennett. " She give you that name in th' beginnin' fer a kind o' joke on her pa. 'N' I c'n tell you I gave him a real good goin' over this mornin'. ' Ef you'd asked me,' I says to him, ' I c'd 'a' told you first off 'at Harry Schwartz was about th' nicest boy in this 'ere town.' An' th' simple idee o' tryin' t' keep a sweet posy of a girl like Mad'lane from havin' beaux. Why,' I says, ' you might 's well try t' keep th' summer from comin' right along after June first.' 'Tain't natur',' I says t' him. He's a real nice man, even ef he is a fur'ner. An' as fer Mad'lane, well, ef she ain't peaches an' cream, I don't know who is." " She'll never look at me again," sighed Harry. " You c'n jes' bet she will. Mad'lane's got plenty o' grit an' gumption, an' she c'n see through a hole in th' wall, even ef th' p'lice is blinder 'n bats. Now you jes' chirk right up, Harry. The Lord ain't forgot you. An' we ain't, neither." Miss Malvina fumbled in her pocket, which for greater safety was hung amid the folds of her petticoat. " Land, I hope I ain't mislaid it," she murmured. " No, here 'tis. It's a note from Mad'lane. Thinks I won't mention it first off, for fear you wouldn't relish your vittles thinkin' about it. Mebbe it'll pass the time away, studyin' it out. She'd 'a' come right along with me, but her pa wa'n't willin', an' I don't know as I blame him none. You wouldn't want Ed Lucas a gawpin' at her." Harry's big brown hand trembled as he reached for the small envelope bearing his name. Miss Malvina picked up her basket. " Now, don't you git downhearted," was her final exhortation. " Ef the's anythin' in holdin' th' thought, like Mis' Rev'ren' Pettibone, her as 'twas Philura Rice, says, you'll be out o' here b'fore you know it. Everybody 'at c'n wag a jaw is prayin' fer you t' beat th' cars. Now, Ed Lucas, I'm a goin'. I c'n see you feel all swelled up with pride t' be lockin' an' unlockin' your feller creeters like they was circus animals. But you want t' r'member pride goes b'fore a fall. An' not s' far ahead of it, neither." Harry did not hear the objectionable sound of the key in the lock on this occasion. He was reading Madeleine's letter in the light from his barred window. It was worth going to jail for, that letter. Harry read it, then folded it carefully and bestowed it in the breast pocket of his coat, where it appeared to diffuse a roseate glow through his entire being. But it must needs be read again, and yet again, while, quite unnoticed, the town clock struck 4, and after an insignificant period, 5. And yet Madeleine had only written this: Mon ami, I have great mad to myself parce que you suffer. Me, I have weep some tears from a past time when I see you. I explain all to mon père. He say to me, Madeleine, you are more simple comme une enfant. I translate for you to say I know nothing no more than a baby. Oh, I am most triste all times, spécialement when I cause to bake les petits gâteaux au raisin de Corinthe. You translate by eat with teeth les gâteaux, which I send you by a very good neighbor, Miss Malvina. Funny word, neighbor. I look for him in dictionnaire. All times I study my dictionnaire very severe. All words astonishing, like wife, I achieve more quick than scat. Beyond, I am also arduous to my grammaire anglaise, and meditate such verb like I love you, you love me, we one another love. Some elegant, nice verb. I have now to desist from write. I make to come to you most respectful regard, very much friendly. Adieu, Madeleine. Grandfather Schwartz, a package of choice Frankfurter sausages and pretzels under his arm, was obliged to announce his presence with more than his usual explosiveness before the prisoner turned from his window, where he appeared deeply engrossed with an insignificant scrap of paper. "Hello, grandfather," said Harry, almost cheerfully. "Wie geht's, son?" responded the old man, with a cautious glance into the corridor. "How you was, eh?" Harry carefully bestowed the letter in the left-hand breast pocket of his coat. "I guess I'm all right, grandfather," he replied, with a notable access of gloom. "As right as I can be in this hole." "Ah, too bad," growled the old man, shaking his head. He sat down heavily on the bench. "A bad business," he muttered. After a longish pause, during which he gazed at Harry with an odd grimace, he added, "I see your father, son. He tell me." Harry stared at the floor. "I guess they'll find out they're mistaken before long," he offered miserably. "You bet," agreed his grandfather, with unlooked-for buoyancy. "So I myself find I was wrong with you, Heinrich. You are a good boy." He pulled Harry down to a seat beside him on the bench. Let me look at you, Heinrich." Harry submitted to his grandfather's arm about his shoulders. "I'm glad if you aren't ashamed of me, grandfather," he murmured. "Father said I thought he didn't seem to understand."
He make me sick. He have no verständnis, my son Heinrich."
The old man stooped his booming whisper to Harry's ear.
"You will not go to prison, son. Nein. You have learned much to me attentive, eh? Good boy."
Harry stared at his grandfather, a doubt of his complete sanity crossing his mind. His mother had succumbed under the shock of his arrest, and now, too evidently, the old man had been crazed by it. He must attempt to divert his attention. "Have you seen mother to-day?" he asked anxiously. Old Heinrich shrugged his shoulders.
"Ja," he drawled, and shook his head. "She is unzurechnungsfähig."
Harry was silent. He wasn't quite sure what unzurechnungsfähig meant.
"Not a mutter for a Deutschhelden."
"You will see, son, what I do.
I bet you from our Kaiser ob dein eiserne Kreuz.
You know what I mean?"
Nein? Ach, you are one big fool, Heinrich. You speak no Dutch.
Well, I learn you one word. Eisernes Kreuz. What you call Iron Cross, so?
You make one big victory for your Vaterland, Heinrich.
Harry was now miserably certain that his grandfather had lost his reason. He wriggled uneasily in the strong grip of the old man's arm about his shoulders. "I guess you'd better go home, grandfather," he said remorsefully. "I hope things will be cleared up by tomorrow. Of course, you know I didn't—"
Sure, Heinrich. No place to talk. I know. I go away, and you see what I do. In Boston we have friends. I tell what I know about my brave uncle Heinrich Schwartz. You will see what happen."
Harry stared. The unnatural complacency of his grandfather troubled him. "What do you mean?" he asked abruptly.
"What I say,"
nodded the senior Schwartz, clapping his grandson resoundingly on the back. Harry's face whitened slowly. He was beginning at last to get the drift of the conversation. "Do you mean you think, you believe I did it?" he shouted.
"For God's sake, grandfather!"
The old man stiffened into a rigid military attitude.
"You have gained a big victory for Germany, nicht wahr?" he asked in a hoarse whisper. "You blow up the wicked factory, eh?"
The big veins swelled on Harry's forehead. He clenched his brown hands. But when at last he answered the proud old man, who had never forgotten the land of his birth, his voice was gentle. "Grandfather," he said slowly, "I'm an American. You don't know what it means to be an American. But try to think, grandfather. I couldn't commit a crime which might have murdered hundreds of people. I couldn't." His head drooped as he perceived the fierce question which leapt to his grandfather's eyes. "I ought never to have worked in the accursed place," he murmured humbly. "It was for the money I did it."
"Ja," growled the old man. "For money you did it. Ach, you are an American. And I think you are a hero."
Without another look at the boy who bore his name, old Schwartz went heavily away. Harry heard the key turn in the lock. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Neighbours by Florence Morse Kingsley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "I'm awfully proud of you, Hoddy dear," declared Mrs. Hobbs, as she set a platter containing 3 lamb chops, fried after the American fashion, before her son. "You've nothing to be proud of, mother," her son said gloomily.
"Oh, if you ain't dyed-in-the-wool British clear to the backbone, Hoddy," complained Mrs. Hobbs, "you'd ought to remember you're half American."
He narrowed his eyes at the rapidly cooling chops.
"Why don't you eat your dinner, Hoddy?" inquired his mother, returning to the table after a trip to the gas range
with a dish of potatoes, also fried and exuding grease.
"My, if you could hear my customers talk about you!"
"Damn glad I can't. Don't listen to them, mother. And for God's sake, don't brag about me. I can't stand it."
"I don't see why you should be so cross about it, Hoddy," soothed his mother, setting a glass of jelly in convenient proximity to her son's plate. "Try some of this nice rhubarb jell. Miss Sadie Scrimger brought it over a purpose for you. She's a real pretty girl, Hoddy, and she says everybody in town is talking about your brave acts at the explosion. I shouldn't wonder if you had a medal presented for saving life."
He choked wordlessly over a fragment of bread which he was in the act of swallowing. His face was crimson as he set down his glass of water.
"They're talking about a Carnegie medal," pursued Mrs. Hobbs complacently, "and Mrs. Obed Salter says her husband was at the town meeting last night, and your name was brought up prominently. For goodness sake, Hoddy, what's the matter?"
Her son had pushed back his chair from his untasted meal.
"Don't you like your chops cooked that way? inquired his mother solicitously. Your father always said I couldn't cook a chop decent. He had his notions, and I guess you got yours, Hoddy. Sometimes I almost wish I'd married an American. British ideas is so odd. But when I think of that young man shut up in jail for blowing up the plant, and of the disgrace and all his poor mother has to stand, I can't help feeling proud of my boy, and glad he ain't got German blood. I should think you'd feel real happy over it, Hoddy, instead of being so down in the mouth you can't eat your victuals. Don't go yet. I got a nice apple pie for dessert. One of my customers brought it in when she came for her fitting. She thinks you're just great, Hoddy. He turned from the door, his hat jammed over his eyes. "I'm going out," he said abruptly. "Don't wait supper for me, Mother." But when he reached the street he paused uncertainly, not observing the eager approach of a lady attired in black and white checks, her hat poised at a coquettish angle over one eye. It was Miss Electa Pratt, and she literally pounced upon the unobservant young man. "Oh, Mr. Hobbs, I'm so glad I have an opportunity of congratulating you in person," italicized Miss Pratt. "It was so awfully noble of you. I am sure not many young men would do anything so grand, risking your life and all. As I was telling Auntie, perhaps you didn't know, but since dear Mamma passed away, I've the sweetest auntie in the world chaperoning me. That noble Mr. Hobbs, I says to Auntie Em, ought to have a laurel wreath, and I've a good mind to make one for him myself. It'd be awfully becoming, don't you know?" And Miss Electa giggled coyly, with the conviction that she had said something peculiarly English. Kitchener Hobbs regarded the disturber of his solitude with stern self-control. "Madam," said he, with a frowning dignity which Miss Electa later described as "perfectly fascinating, don't you know? I beg that you will do nothing of the sort. I'm not entitled to a laurel wreath, nor to your distinguished praise." With that he whipped off his hat and strode away, before the lady could devise a valid excuse for detaining him. He had definitely made up his mind where he was going, and he marched towards his objective point with all the courage needed to face a storm of shrapnel. It was Horatio Herbert Kitchener, with a very small admixture of Hobbs, who presently met Madeleine Desaye walking slowly along, all sweet colour gone from her face, her slight figure sagging like a slim birch tree under the bitter assault of the north wind. Kitchener Hobbs halted her with a peremptory gesture. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "Home," she replied, but the word was an irrepressible sob. "What's the matter with you?" was his succeeding inquiry, but he thought he knew. She was mute before his searching gaze. "You know I love you," he said sternly. She looked up, her eyes unnaturally big and dark. "I'm reminding you of this because I need some sort of excuse. Of course there isn't any." He paused to kick a pebble out of his path. "Me, I love Harry," she quavered piteously. "You know Harry?" She choked, a slender hand at her throat. "I call him Le Noir just for funny. Harry, he likes that name, Le Noir. Mais now I have large tristesse to myself because I make that funny." He was gazing at her, his grey eyes full of the sadness she had confessed. "Madeleine," he said slowly, "after today you will never see me again. But before I go—" He stopped short, further utterance suddenly impossible. Rain began to fall from the low-hanging clouds. "I mustn't keep you standing here," he said hurriedly. "I'm rather a rotten sort of bounder, what I called Schwartz that night and afterward. But I'm sorry, in time. I'm going there now, to the inquiry, I mean. Do you understand me? I'm afraid I can't speak decent French today." She nodded. All persons speak like pretty kettle of fish. Everybody mad to Harry.
Have you been there, at the hearing?
Oh, no, monsieur. Miss Malvina, she say so. I am wait at corner, me.
You should have told them how he got his name, Lenoir.
My father not permit. He say to me, go home, Madeleine, immediatement. Me, I am make quick track.
The cold drops on her cheeks reproached him poignantly. See here, he said in a firm voice. Perhaps I've no right to be taking things into my own hands, but we've got to put up a stiff fight to save him now. They're all against him, and the police have worked out a bloody chain of circumstantial evidence. Come on.
To him?
She breathed, a faint colour staining her cheeks. The preliminary hearing, necessary to a formal indictment of Heinrich Schwartz, accused of wilfully causing the destruction of the Merck's munitions plant, was drawing to a close. The evidence against the accused had been strong, his defence weak. He had obtained employment under the alias Lenoir for the express purpose of concealing his German name. This much the prisoner had confessed. But so far, after the most rigid examination, continued throughout one entire night, the accused had stubbornly refused to divulge the names of his associates in crime. There was little doubt that the government detectives would, during the course of the trial, succeed in unearthing a sinister, far-reaching plot, which would involve persons of the highest standing. The prisoner Schwartz, it was plain, was merely a tool in an august hand. This much the reporters had added to copious reports of the proceedings, to be hastily licked into shape for the evening papers, when two persons entered the crowded courtroom. The magistrate, a local official rather dazed by the spotlight of publicity thus suddenly focused upon him, was about to pronounce the words which would condemn the prisoner to the long torture of a trial by jury, with no uncertain outcome. It was evident the magistrate had no doubt of the prisoner's guilt. Calvin S. Northrop, counsel for the accused, kept his own private convictions well hidden under a mask of frowning silence. He had made up his mind to prove his client insane, and having thus determined, Mr. Northrop rather resented the intrusion of fresh evidence insisted upon by the two persons before mentioned when they had forced their way through the crowd. The bunched reporters simultaneously noted the beauty of the girl and the stern good looks of the young man who accompanied her. The Associated Press photographer slipped a fresh plate into position, while the usual legal preliminaries were in progress. The girl was permitted to testify first.
Oui, monsieur. I am acquainted with Harry Schwartz for a long time. I call him Lenoir when to my father I present him. Me, I make of Schwartz one French name, you understand, no? My father hate all such ugly German name as Schwartz. Very ugly, you see? Me, I like Harry. So easy as roll from log, I quick translate. Schwartz, very dark. What you call black, like night. Le noir, you see? Oui, monsieur. Harry, he likes that nice French name better than Schwartz. I give him that name. He like it. No, monsieur, I not tell my father such a funny joke. Not for a long time. My father, he is very mad to German. We are of Alsace, monsieur.
Informed that the accused had already confessed to adopting the name Lenoir in order to obtain employment at the Merck's plant, Mlle. Desaye blushed very sweetly.
Me, I am aware, she said. Harry, he like to earn money to make house. You know what is to make house for marry?
The reporters were writing like mad. Even the solemnly important magistrate smiled. He had once built a house for his bride. His next question brought the quick blood to the prisoner's face, but Madeleine answered it with sweet composure.
Oui, monsieur. Harry, he like to marry me, myself. I explain to you. Harry, he call himself Lenoir to earn quick simoleon for home. A fine, elegant word, home. Me, I like to live in some nice home of Harry. Her glance at the prisoner was the merest flicker of long lashes, but it carried with it the sweetest assurance. The Associated Press artist was recording impressionistic sketches as fast as his nimble pencil would work, featuring Madeleine Desaye as she gave her deliciously quaint testimony, which entirely exonerated the accused from inventing the French alias for some sinister purpose, of the beautiful French girl taking her seat beside the weeping mother of the prisoner, of the piquant profile of the witness, with its delicately tip-tilted nose and the bewitching curve of lips and chin. He paused only for a deliberately appraising look at the young Englishman who succeeded Mlle. Desaye upon the stand. " Some name," murmured the nearest reporter, as he inscribed the hieroglyphs representing Horatio Herbert Kitchener Hobbs upon his pad. Mr. Hobbs told his story baldly. " I saw the accident," he stated. " A girl in the filling shed dropped a wire hairpin as she left the place. It somehow landed on the belt of the motor-driven shaft. There was a spark. It caused the explosion. Schwartz wasn't near the place. I saw him in the yard, 50 feet or more away, 2 minutes before the explosion. He's innocent." When asked why he had not come forward with this important bit of testimony before, Hobbs bit his lips and turned noticeably pale. " I see no reason why you should ask that question," he said stiffly. " I was not called as a witness. What I've told you is God's truth. What more do you want? " After all, the magistrate was human. So were the lawyers and the reporters and the rest, including the artist. There was a rigid cross-examination, of course, on the part of the prosecution, establishing certain technical points. But in the end the testimony of Horatio Herbert Kitchener Hobbs stood. As the witness stepped down from the stand, M. Desaye, who stood with folded arms looking on at the scene, observed that he cast a single quick glance at Madeleine, but he did not attempt to speak to her. His face was sternly controlled as he replied monosyllabically to the questions showered upon him by the reporters. There were those who declared that the young Englishman refused to further enlighten the representatives of the press, and that he bolted from the room without so much as a word to the man he had saved. But in the light of later events, the conduct of Kitchener Hobbs earned him not even a 9 days' wonder. Being out of sight in those days was tantamount to being swiftly forgotten, and no one in Innisfield, except perhaps the station master at the departure of the evening train, ever set eyes upon young Hobbs after he left the courtroom. It was generally known on the following day that the Hobbses had left town. Nobody appeared to know where they had gone. The sign bearing the words Madame Louise, Robes, swung fitfully in the wind for perhaps a week longer. Then one day it was taken down and replaced by another, presenting to the public eye the advantages to be derived from a visit to the skilled chiropodist one flight up. And yet the disappearance of the American Mrs. Hobbs and her son, who was a British subject, was merely a logical sequence of preceding events. Mrs. Hobbs was busily engaged in draping a lay figure with voluminous folds of mustard-coloured voile when her son tramped heavily up the stair. Without a glance at his mother, he sat down in a chair by the table, where the neglected dinner still sojourned amid its congealed grease. " Oh, for goodness' sake, Hoddy! " exclaimed Mrs. Hobbs, removing a quantity of pins from between her teeth. " You wouldn't eat your dinner when it was nice and hot, and now " He turned his head slowly and looked at her. Mrs. Hobbs was a commonplace person, with limited powers of insight and imagination. But not even the dullest woman could have gazed upon that tragic young face without a stirring of the emotions. Mrs. Hobbs dropped the mustard-coloured stuff, while her scissors, hung by a cord about her neck, clashed noisily against the earthenware teapot as she leaned across the table. " Hoddy! " she cried. " What's happened? Are you sick? " Then she ran to him and took his comely head in her arms. " Hoddy," she whispered, " what is it? Tell mother." He turned and buried his face on her shoulder. "Oh, Mother," he groaned, "I'm so bloody miserable." But she couldn't be made to understand the cause of his unhappiness, even after he had honestly tried to tell her everything. "Why, Hoddy," she said, "I don't see why you should feel so bad over it. You haven't done anything to be ashamed of. You was a real hero at the fire, Hoddy. Everybody says so. Lots of folks would have been killed if it hadn't been for you. And you say they let that Schwartz fellow off after you went of your own accord and told. I think it was real noble of you." The blood rushed to his temples and hammered there. "You can never see," he choked. "It must be because you're—" He swallowed the words with an effort. "Oh, but, Hoddy dear, I wish you'd try and be sensible for once, and—" He fetched a deep breath. "If you'd ever call me by my name," he murmured, despair in his voice. She looked at him sharply. "You mean you don't like I should call you Hoddy?" she said. "Why, I've always called you Hoddy since you were a baby." "My name," he went on unsteadily, "is Horatio Herbert Kitchener, and I've allowed a man to go to jail because I was jealous. Does that convey anything to your mind? I meant to let him go to prison, to death, anything to get him out of my way. I'm a liar, with that name. I'm a coward, with that name. I'm a murderer, with that name. Oh, my God, Mother!" Mrs. Hobbs sank weakly into a chair and mopped her eyes with the breadth of the mustard-coloured stuff. In the silence, broken by his hard, wrenching sobs, she went back over the brief story of his life. It seemed to her scarcely more than a year or so since he was a little, little boy, playing with his tops and marbles. He always had such beautiful eyes, and his hair was like silk to the touch. She found herself touching it now, almost timidly. "Hoddy," she said close to his ear, "I'm going to let you go. I'm not going to hold you back any longer, from the war, I mean. I'll go with you, Hoddy. You can enlist as soon as we get home. I guess maybe you ought to, after all." And having thus made the supreme renunciation, she was equal to what followed. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Neighbours by Florence Morse Kingsley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Monsieur Etienne Desaye sat in his favourite chair by the window, in an attitude of deep dejection. All about him on the floor scattered newspapers, both French and English, bore witness to the fact that Monsieur Desaye had been spending his Sunday in a characteristically American manner. His rumpled hair and the deep pucker between his brows evidenced the singular dissatisfaction he had derived from his survey of the world's doings. The house was very quiet, save for a moaning little wind, which seemed to be seeking entrance about the doors and windows of the shabby old house. He wondered a little as to the whereabouts of his daughter Madeleine. He had not seen her since déjeuner, being dimly aware thereafter of her fresh young voice in the kitchen, warbling certain old French chansons he had taught her when a child. Absorbed in a disquieting account of his country's economic condition, he had scarcely lifted his eyes from his reading when she paused for a moment on her way upstairs. He had not heard her come down. Monsieur Desaye arose, spurning the illustrated edition with his foot. For perhaps 10 minutes he marched up and down the room, unwonted thoughts stirring in his mind. Where was Madeleine? He would go upstairs and see. But a visit to her nest of a chamber under the eaves revealed nothing save the evidences of a hasty toilette. Monsieur Desaye picked up a knot of rose-coloured ribbon exhaling a faint perfume. He sighed deeply. It had not been soberly considered, this coming to America. And now he felt that he must return. No longer could he remain, enjoying an unearned and inglorious idleness, while France grew pale and cold from uncounted wounds. " I am no less than a coward," he told himself between clenched teeth. But what of Madeleine? Had she been dearer to him than France? Was it because of her he had fled from his duty to this alien land, where even now the distant rumblings of war could be heard? Very gently he put down the rose-coloured token of youth. It was as if he had laid Madeleine herself upon the blood-stained altar of his country. He had at length determined upon his course. Neither tears nor pleadings should deflect him from it. His brow was still corrugated with care when half an hour later he presented himself in frock-coated elegance at the door of Mlle. Dubois Bennett. He had come, he said, to seek counsel from Madame sa mère. " Oh, now ain't that too bad? " regretted Miss Malvina, recognizing the importance of the occasion as her eyes perused the person of her neighbor from his polished boots to the tricolour of France in his buttonhole. " Ma don't go out once in a coon's age. But today Miss Adelbert Cummins, hers was Mirandy Dubois, come after Ma in her auto, and I says to Ma, ' You go right along,' I says, ' and don't you come back till you're good and ready.' Miss Cummins wanted Ma should stay all night, because there was a third cousin of hern comin' to dinner. So here I be all b' my lonesome. But come right in, do. I'd be pleased to see you, even if Ma ain't at home." M. Desaye hesitated for the fraction of a minute. It occurred to him that possibly he might be committing an indiscretion in thus visiting the unchaperoned Miss Malvina, but the sight of the glistening silver curls about her temple reassured him. He remembered that he was no longer young, and neither was Miss Malvina. Much could be overlooked in the conduct of persons no longer young. They were presently seated in the haircloth parlour, facing one another from two slippery chairs with carved rosewood backs, designed especially to remind frail mortals of the passage of the moments. M. Desaye gazed earnestly at Miss Malvina. She was wearing a lavender gown with a garniture of yellowish lace. Miss Malvina's cheeks were of an unwonted pink, and her eyes shone under her white curls. " Say, first off, I want to tell you the smart trick Miss Rev. Pettibone's yellow dog played on me yisterday," she began, without waiting for her visitor to unfold his errand. " I might 's well speak right out, for see, you can't help noticin' my loss. My nice black hair front was a layin' on a cheer, right where I could put my hand on it if the door bell rang. Well, I seen Philura and the baby a comin' in the gate, and the dog a followin' 'em, as large as life. But thinks, says I, Mrs. Rev. Pettibone knows my hair's been gray since I was 20, so I left my front a layin' careless. Well, the baby, he sat there on an old comfort I keep a purpose for babies when their ma's bein' fitted, playin' with a string of empty spools. And Fido, he set solemn as a judge a watchin' the baby. Miss Pettibone was tellin' what a wonderful dog Fido Pettibone was, when she wa'n't relatin' incidents about the baby, with me a listenin' patient while I draped the goods for her skirt, like they do in Sher Paris, as Mrs. Hobbs used to say, when all of a sudden I noticed Fido. He was worryin' somethin' in the corner and growlin' fierce, and the baby was laughin' to beat the band. He'd stole my hair front. By the time we got it from him, there wa'n't nothin' left but the foundation. I felt pretty well cut up over it, and Miss Philura she said she'd buy me a new one in a nice medium shade of brown. But I says, no, Mr. Pettibone's salary, I says, wasn't planned for purchasin' luxuries. Besides, I says, Fido didn't know no better. I guess I told Mrs. Pettibone a fib, but I says to her I'd made up my mind to look old and be done with it. So here I be." M. Desaye had listened to Miss Malvina's explanation of her bereft condition with an air of profound interest, his occasional well-timed gestures and murmured comments sustaining the little lady's narrative to its conclusion. " Mes compliments to Fido," he observed gently. " I have to thank that most noble animal for a deed of kindness performed." For land's sake, do you mean to tell me your liking looks better without my front? Demanded Miss Malvina excitedly. Précisément, murmured Monsieur Desaye. You have now the air gentil, autrefois regrettably lacking. Merci, grâce à Dieu. Well, I declare, breathed Miss Bennet. I'm relieved to hear you say that. I suppose, being French, you'd admire most anything stylish and handsome. Oh, but if you don't... Miss Malvina paused uncertainly, the faint colour in her cheek deepening to rose. Monsieur Desaye sighed. Dear friend, he said, I am about to bid you adieu. I have determined, I have resolved. No longer I remain in America, supinely attentive to the groans of France. I go, I fly to offer my breast to the sword that seeks her life. Monsieur Desaye had considered this eloquent explanation of his purposes with care, hence its bewildering effect upon his listener. Miss Malvina's late blooming roses withered on the instant. "You're going away?" she quavered. "You and Madeleine? Just as Ma and me was getting used to having you for neighbours." "Noblesse oblige. I can no longer remain," assented Monsieur Desaye with an eloquent gesture. "But of Madeleine I would speak. I regret to tear Madeleine from your most kind affection and the discreet curatelle of Madame votre mère. It is of this I would speak beyond." Miss Malvina sighed, her eyes seeking the window where an hour earlier she had watched Madeleine walking with Harry Schwartz in an almost visible aureole of happiness. "I should certainly hope not," she agreed warmly, "considering Madeleine's got a steady beau and can't be beat nowheres in France, to say nothing of Europe. When it comes to husbands, a good, plain American is good enough for me. If you'll leave her with Ma Bennett and me, we'll take care of her till Harry can afford to get married." Monsieur Desaye frowned thoughtfully. "Your country also faces war," he said, "but it will not invade your homes, as in France." He cast a swiftly appraising glance about the sparsely furnished room, his thoughts meanwhile sweeping the wider prospect of his past and future. "It is improbable I return," he said at length. Two large tears welled up in Miss Malvina's eyes, trembled for an instant on her lashes, and then without pretence of concealment rolled down her cheeks. Monsieur Desaye observed the phenomenon gravely. It suggested a heretofore unconsidered way out of his dilemma. He arose and with careful dignity bowed low before the lady who had thus honoured him with her tears. "Sans cérémonie, ma chère amie, since the hour it is brief, let me ask that you do me the grand honour of becoming before my departure Madame Desaye. Most happy I leave my Madeleine in your care. You will consent, oui?" Miss Malvina trembled to her feet. "Oh, what? You want I should... Oh, I'm afraid I don't... I am request that you honor me by marry... Oh, I regret I have not proper English to speak and no dictionary in pocket. You understand me, oui?" "Well, I ain't quite a ninny," said Miss Malvina, recovering her self-possession. "You want I should marry you, so to look after Madeleine when you're gone back to France. I guess that's about the size of it." She nodded emphatically. "Ah, you have speak most noble. I thank you, dear friend. You shall not regret it, I promise." Miss Malvina submitted, as on previous occasions, to the touch of bearded lips upon her hand. A wave of rose-coloured mist appeared to enfold her. Monsieur Desaye was of a sudden radiant, loquacious. Like one in a dream, she heard him setting forth his plans for an immediate marriage, with incomprehensible details concerning appanage and dot.
Also, he apologized profusely for not having asked the honour of her hand in marriage from Madame Dubois Bennet, as was indeed right and proper. Miss Malvina roused herself at this. " I don't know as Ma'll have any real objections to offer," she said with dignity. " An' I guess mebbe I'm old enough to speak for myself." Then, without warning, a sob escaped her tremulous lips. " I wish I wa'n't so old," she whispered. " If I was only young an' han'some, like as not you'd But land! I guess you'll think I'm crazy for thinkin' of such a thing." She wiped her eyes and sealed up her tears with an energetic sniff. M. Desaye was looking at her very kindly. If he did not entirely comprehend her thoughts, his Gallic sympathies suggested his quick rejoinder. " Hélas! " he murmured. " It is true we are no longer possess of la jeunesse. But I find you most charmante, chère Miss Malvina. For you I shall ever cherish la considération profonde." Miss Malvina smiled bravely. " I'll be good to Madeleine," she said, " an' I hope she won't mind me bein' her stepmother. 'Course I c'n see why you thought o' marryin' me. 'Tain't like we was young folks. But I'd reelly like to stand up to be married in a white dress. I c'n keep it to put away afterwards, to look at an' remember." Again M. Desaye's active imagination rose to the occasion. He took Miss Malvina's work worn little hand in his. " Chere amie," said he, " I have not deserved such bonheur. On a far distant battlefield I shall also remember." From his finger he drew a ring, fashioned of gold and bearing a heraldic device of dragons in deadly combat. Miss Malvina's fingers were rough with needle pricks and her joints bore witness to rheumatic pains humbly borne. But the quaint old ring, treasured through many generations, slipped easily into place. " For remember of most happy heure," he said gently. Chapter 29 Chapter 30 of Neighbours by Florence Morse Kingsley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When Ma Bennett, fairly brimming over with details of her visit to Mrs. Adelbert Cummings, arrived home on the following afternoon, she found her daughter surrounded by breadths of shimmering white material, which she was busily engaged in fashioning into a gown. " For land sake, Malviny !" exclaimed the old lady. " That looks like a weddin' dress." Miss Malvina's needle described a sort of flying arc of basting stitches about a small arm size. " 'Tis," she said briefly. " When creation's goin' t' git married? " inquired Ma. " I bet you couldn't guess if you was to try a year," twinkled Miss Malvina. " 'Twas unbeknownst t' me till yist'day." Ma Bennett sat down heavily, her eyes blinking behind her far sighted specs. " Is it Sadie Buckthorn? " she inquired. " I heard she's keepin' comp'ny with a young man from Boston." " Nope," said Miss Malvina, inserting a long seam under the needle of her machine and snapping down the presser foot. " 'Tain't nobody you'd ever think, nor me neither, for that matter. I thought I should have had a double duck fit when I heard of it." Ma Bennett gazed searchingly at her daughter's face during the deafening whir which marked the passage of the shining white stuff under the busy needle. " You do look kind o' worked up, even yet," she commented. " When's the weddin' comin' off? "" A Wednesday afternoon at 4:00 at the pars'nage," particularized Miss Malvina, smiles rippling over her face like breezes over a wheat field. " My ! I guess most everybody'll be some s'prised when it gits out Thursday." " Malviny Bennett, who's a goin' t' git married? " demanded Ma, with rising asperity. " You cert'nly can be th' aggravatin'est person when you've a mind to." " You're invited to the ceremony, Ma,"
offered Miss Malvina, evading the maternal wrath with a demure smile of protest. " Me invited? I don't believe no such thing." " True's preachin', an' so be I, Ma. I got out your best black silk this mornin' early, while I was waitin' for the stores to open, an' I fixed the waist an' put some real han'some lace on the sleeves. You'll look scrumptious, Ma." " What you goin' t' wear, Malviny? " inquired the old lady suspiciously. " I'll bet you're jes' foolin', anyhow. I sh'd think you'd ruther hear me tell about Mis' Adelbert Cummins' new parlor furniture." Miss Malvina canted her curly head to one side, as she gazed earnestly at the inchoate garment in her lap. " I got t' hurry s' like all possessed t' git this 'ere dress done b' t'morrow night. I ain't reelly got time t' dig up any curiosity," she said. " It's a goin' t' be made up princess, with a trail. I can't abide these 'ere short skirts with a breadth o' goods tacked on th' back, like they're wearin' now. This 'ere's goin' t' be a reg'lar weddin' dress. How'd you like th' goods, Ma? Ain't it shiny an' pretty, kind o' like my hair, when you come t' think of it? I guess 'twould be right becomin' t' me." " Well, I guess you've gone plumb crazy, Malviny," commented the old lady sternly. " I want a cup o' tea, an' I want it good an' hot." " Teapot's on th' stove, Ma. Say, don't you want t' know who's a goin' t' step off'n this 'ere dress? "" Don't know 's I do," sniffed Ma. " When folks is s' smart an' uppity 's you be, I b'lieve in lettin' 'em alone till they git good an' ready." " It's me, Ma," cried Miss Malvina, laughing, but with a mist in her eyes which momentarily obscured the glistening bridal web. " I'm a goin' t' marry our neighbor, Mr. Desaye, so he c'n go t' th' war over in France an' leave Mad'lane. See, I'll be her step ma, an' you'll be her gran 'ma. Won't that be lovely? "" Malviny Bennett! " screamed the old lady. " You ain't tellin' me th' gospel truth! "" Yes, I be, Ma. It's jes' 's true 's I'm a settin' here in this chair, a sewin' on m' own weddin' dress. He ast me yist'day, an' I says yes. Thinks I, folks ought t' accomydate their neighbors. Want t' see my engagement ring? " Confronted with this visible token of the impending event, Ma Bennett gasped. " Ain't you some older 'n he is? " she inquired feebly. " I dunno, 'n' I don't keer a cotton hat," stated Miss Malvina. " The' wa'n't nothin' said about ages. But I guess he ain't so awful young but what he knows his mind. An' I ain't, neither." The little dressmaker's head drooped low over the buttonhole she was fashioning. " 'Tain't so t' say a weddin' like most folks," she breathed. " He's a goin' off th' same day on th' 11 o'clock train. We're goin' t' hev supper over t' his house, an' he wants we sh'd go over there t' live after he's gone. He's bought th' house off Mis' Rev'ren' Pettibone an' put it in my name. He says you an' me '11 never hev t' want, Ma. He's got everythin' fixed so there'll be money comin' in reg'lar, with a dot fer Mad'lane settin' out when she comes t' git married, an' all. The' ain't nothin' he ain't thought of. An' Mad'lane, she says she loves me like a mare already. That don't mean a horse, Ma, though it does sound like it." " Where 'd you say he's a goin'? " inquired the old lady. " T' Boston? " She appeared to have retreated into the dim mists of age, where echoes from the outer world reach the ears faintly. She fumbled with her bonnet strings, her old hands trembling. " Land! I ought t' 'a' got you hot tea first off," said her daughter contritely. " Here, you set right down, Ma, an' I'll git it ready in 2 jerks of a lamb's tail. You're all tuckered out, what with your visit an' all." Mrs. Pettibone was attired in her best brocade dress, exhibiting large purple flowers on a black background, though it was only 3:30 in the afternoon. It was a handsome dress. Mrs. Pettibone rustled in its ample folds so richly that the baby's wide bright eyes exhibited his pleased surprise. He even refrained from his wonted squeal when his mother invested his small person in a clean white dress, the sleeves of which were a trifle small as compared with his chubby fists. " You've got to wear it, precious," cooed Mrs. Pettibone, " because Auntie Bennett made it for you. And you're going to stand up at her wedding. There now, mother's lamb. My, how sweet he is! Oh, doesn't it seem a pity, Silas? " Mr. Pettibone, engaged in knotting a fresh white tie, glanced at his family with a grave smile. " Do you mean it's a pity the baby is sweet, my dear? " he inquired. " Oh, of course not. I was thinking of Malvina." "Ah!" " Seeing the baby looking so perfectly darling, well, you know, I couldn't help thinking how dreadful to be a widow on one's wedding day. It amounts to that, of course. If he goes to France and gets killed "" It is just possible M. Desaye may survive," suggested the minister. " Some do, you know." " He's going to offer his breast to the German bayonets. Malvina said so. And if a person does that "" I believe they're coming, my dear Philura," interposed the minister hastily. " Do try and be your optimistic self. One should hold the thought." " Yes, of course. I'm going to insist that he's coming back safe some day or other. Silas, do you think we're going to have war in this country? " The minister was saved from the pain of avowing his convictions on this point by the arrival of the wedding party, and presently they were all gathered in the hushed parlour which had witnessed so many marriages in days past: Miss Malvina in her snowy splendours, M. Desaye stern and pale as he thought of his future, Ma Bennett dim and ancient as some faded daguerreotype, Madeleine tremulous between grief and joy, and Harry Schwartz, awed into almost rigid gravity by the talk he had had with Madeleine's father a few hours since. Mrs. Pettibone, in her rustling brocade reminiscent of her own wedding, held her baby close while the solemn words were being spoken, from the " Dearly beloved, we are assembled," to the final sonorous " Amen." There followed the strange little silence which seems quite as much a part of the ceremony as the wedding ring. Then M. Desaye, looking very tall and elegant in his rather shabby frock coat with the tricolour of France in its buttonhole, bent over his bride and deliberately kissed her on the lips. " My wife," he whispered, with all the generous warmth of a nature which could envision the belated and frost bitten romance she would cherish to the end. Yet it was not a sad wedding. The bride wore a radiant look which forbade all futile sympathy. " We was bound t' go, anyhow," she told Mrs. Pettibone. " An' now I've got a right t' think of him affectionate, an' I c'n talk everything over with Madeleine. B'sides, Ma an' me's goin' t' live in a nice house with runnin' water an' all, an' we'll have Madeleine t' love an' t' cherish." Her voice broke a little over the last words, but her smile was all sunshine as she embraced and kissed the girl who wept in her arms. " That's right, dearie," she soothed her. " Jes' you cry it out on mother's shoulder, an' you'll feel better. An' here's Harry a longin' t' comfort you, too. We're a goin' t' take care o' this little girl, ain't we, Harry? "" Yes, Miss Malvina," said Harry firmly, " we will." Mrs. Pettibone, holding up the baby to be kissed, smiled. " We shall all be obliged to remember that our dear Miss Malvina is Madame Desaye now," she said. The bride looked startled. " Madame Desaye? " she repeated wonderingly. " Well, I d'clare t' goodness, that part of it never occurred t' me. I've been so took up with all that's happened, 'n' like that. But here I be, sure 's you live. Madame Desaye, well, I guess. But reflections of a practical sort could wait until tomorrow. Of today, her wedding day, there yet remained several golden hours, as bright as the shining new ring upon her hand, which Monsieur Desaye had put there to keep the other company. There was the supper, for one thing, cooked and served by Mrs. Louisa Wessells, with divers amendments by Madeleine. To be sure, no one of the party, with the possible exception of Ma Bennett, knew what they were eating. Miss Malvina, Miss no longer, sat at the head of the table in her shining bridal white, with Monsieur Desaye opposite. Harry and Madeleine, their hands clasped under the cloth, faced Ma, who was informing Mrs. Wessells that the tea was stone cold. " If I wasn't teetotally flabbergasted," declared Mrs. Wessells, as she described the scene later in the various kitchens of her clientele, " I dunno as I'd have believed my ears if anybody had told me about that dinner. Yes'm, they had wine, but 'twas this 'ere kind made in France that they say don't make folks drunk. It didn't make me drunk, for I took down so much as a teacupful out in the kitchen afterwards, an' I only broke one vegetable dish an' two o' them casseroles, as she calls 'em. I says to Miss Malvina, ' Ain't you a member of the W.C.T.U.? ' I says, jes' like that. ' Hush !' says she. ' It's only for this once,' says she, ' to drink toast with.' ' Toast? ' I says. ' I ain't made no toast, an' what's more I ain't a goin' to. You got more 'n enough as 'tis,' I says. Well, they kep' it up for more 'n an hour. I didn't git home till past 9 o'clock. She wanted I should wash up all them dishes, an' I done it. Yes'm, she sat there eatin' her p'tatoes an' meat in a white silk dress, all trimmed up with lace an' pearl tossles, an' a big bunch o' white roses a layin' alongside on the table. Yes'm, I sh'd 'a' thought she'd 'a' wanted to put on somethin' plainer to eat her vittles in, but she didn't. An' by I seen her out in the yard with him. Yes'm, she was a trailin' that there white dress o' hern right down the front steps. No'm, I didn't ketch what he said to her. But he's gone all right. That fur'n girl of his'n told me he was goin' to the war, when she give me my $2. Yes'm, he left her a grass widder the same day they was married, but I guess she'll be sod all right afore the year's out. He'll either git drownded by one o' them nasty sudsmarines they talk s' much about, or else he'll git killed over there. The' ain't s' much to pick an' choose betwixt 'em, says I to Georgie." But it was not of their uncertain future the newly wedded pair spoke, as they walked arm in arm in the moonlight. That the moon chanced to be at its full was a matter for wondering happiness to the bride. " I always kind o' hankered to go walkin' in the moonlight along with the beau," she confided to her companion. " An' here I be, a walkin' out with you." His hand sought hers. " Of a possibility we shall again make together the promenade," he said. " It is of this you must think." After a pause he added: " I have still the regret profond for Madeleine. My daughter should not marry with a German." " Who, Harry? Harry ain't a German. Course he ain't. Lots o' times I heard Mis' Schwartz, her as 'twas Melissy Meadowcroft, tell about her great gran 'father, Cap'n Meadowcroft. He was English, way back in th' old colony days, an' he married a real Injun princess, I forget her name. So you see Harry ain't German no more 'n I be. He's real American, Harry is, an' he'll take awful good care o' Madeleine. He's a goin' t' build a bran new house. Mis' Schwartz told Ma so." M. Desaye shook his head. " Not a present," he said. " I have advise him no, for now. Beyond, the skies in America are dark with war. Aussi, your country owes to France the red blood of Pettigott. He glanced hurriedly at his watch. But of this suffisamment. To you, cher ami, I devote my last moment. You will be happy, n'est-ce pas? All my best treasure I am leave with you. Her upturned face, pale with anticipated grief, seemed the face of youth in the dim moonlight. I'm a-goin' to miss you somethin' fierce, she confessed. Oh, but I'm glad I can love you after you've gone. You won't mind, way out there. Of course I know why we was married and all. I ain't a-goin' to worry Madeleine none be takin' on. I'm a-goin' to be real bright and cheerful and take good care of your best treasure. Ah, you have loved me a little, n'est-ce pas? He wondered. How I am happy to hear that. In France, I remember my wife and my child, together in my heart toujours. Then, because her steadfast face quivered beneath his gaze, he gathered the small white figure in his arms. Together in my heart always, he murmured. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Neighbours by Florence Morse Kingsley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31, L'Envoi. To Monsieur Etienne de Say, somewhere in France. My dear and respected husband, your letters to me and Madeleine come this morning. To say we was fairly keeled over with joy is to put it mild. Madeleine has been writing to you in French all morning, but I ain't up to snuff yet. But I'm coming on. Me and Madeleine talk French most all the time, doing up the dishes and like that. Even Ma has learned how to ask for the butter, and is her tea boiling hot. I will say it makes a nice change to hear it said in a foreign language. Well, husband, you had ought to see how nice we're fixed, now we're all living in our own home together. Madeleine insisted I was to sleep in your room, and Ma sleeps in the room over the front hall, being next to me, with Madeleine over the dining room as before. Everything is house cleaned and looking as neat as wax. I was put in mind of the day after you moved in and I come over to help, being a next door neighbour. I ain't never forgot how you wanted to pay me. I guess I got paid all right, n'est-ce pas? I grieve to tell you was dead right about the war. We are a-going to have one, and Harry Schwartz has enlisted in the Navy. He says it's strictly up to him to prove he's an American citizen after all that's come and gone. Madeleine is real brave, and only cries nights sometimes. Then I go in and cuddle her up like I was her mother. Oh, she's a real little comfort, and we love each other dearer every passin' day. I see your looks in her constant, more especial your eyes and the cant of your head in talking. There's one thing I have to tell you which maybe you won't like so well, but I made up my mind 'twas best, all things considered. You prob'ly recollect I've been sewing most all my life, and to set and baste a seam by the window with an eye to the passin' comes natural to me. Well, husband, after folks found out I was married, I guess most every woman in this town come to see me. They couldn't seem to realize it first off, but when I showed off my 2 rings they was forced to believe. Like as not, you'll snicker right out when I tell you I felt real mad to have all the folks calling me Miss Malvina, same as before. That ain't my rightful title, I says to Mrs. Deaconess Buckthorn. I'm a married woman, I says to her, full as much as you be, and my name is Madame de Say. You can ask the Reverend Pettibone, I says, and he'll tell you 'tis the gospel truth. Well, husband, what with the above, and all the women folk pestering the life out of me to make up their spring suits, I give in at last and sent for Henry Pratt to paint me a sign reading Madame de Say, Robes. I guess folks will soon learn my rightful name, seeing it on the front of the house in gold letters. Madeleine views all my acts sensible, and she ain't a mite of objection to anything I done. I calc'late to save all extra cash for Madeleine's dote, as you call it. 'Twon't do no harm, I says, to leave money a-layin' in the bank for a spell. I hope you will think I done right, more especial about the sign. It cost me $3.25, bein' war prices. While I sit writin' this at the desk in your room upstairs, I see our Madeleine talkin' to Harry Schwartz down by the front gate. He expects to join his ship to morrow, so the poor young things is going through what we did not so long ago. I found the waist of my weddin' dress all spotted up with tears when I come to lay it away in blue paper to keep it from turnin' yellow, and right off the bat I put a handsome double cascade of lace on to cover it. It looks full as stylish as before, if not stylisher. But I ain't a-goin' to forget what's in under them lace frills as long as I live. Those spots was true heart tears for one I love more than tongue can tell, like it says in the Bible. I hope this letter finds you in health. Very respectfully, your affectionate wife, Malvina Dubois Bennett de Say. P.S. Some name, n'est-ce pas? End of chapter 31. End of Neighbours by Florence Morse Kingsley.